All right, welcome class. We are going to be talking about your second reading from Sharon Begley's book, Train Your Mind, Change Your Brain. I hope you're finding it manageable and interesting. Again, I find this stuff fascinating. We're going to be talking about some important elements with regard to neuroplasticity, and she sort of begins to make the transition in chapter 8, relating this to more important issues. So we've been dealing with things like how my hands work and the brain activity associated with that. We'll be talking some about that today, but then also going into, well, what about childhood attachment and how that affects relationships, trust, moral issues like empathy and compassion and human behavior, our willingness to help. Because those are the kinds of things that we care about in this class with regard to morality and with regard to spiritual formation. So is there evidence that that kind of behavior can be trained and that we can reshape our brains to make those things more common, right? More natural, as it were. So let's begin, though, with chapter 2, The Enchanted Loom. I'm going to start with a few quotes here, right? Habits both produce and are reflections of changes in the brain. I'm not going to go through all the different experiments she cites. She does a great job, I think, explaining them. We'll talk about a few. Know that these quotes often come after she's given experimental data and evidence to show that this is the case, right? That habits produce changes in the brain. You can see how this is connected to the course, right? To what we've been learning about virtue. Neuroscience is simply validating what Aristotle said thousands of years ago. Habits and practices can reshape our very nature so that what comes natural to us is different. Our habits and practices can create new neural networks, right? The more habitually you make a particular movement, the more of the brain's real estate is zoned for that movement. The more I do something, playing an instrument, learning a new language, learning a hobby like fly fishing or skiing, or practicing acts of charity, love, compassion, confession, the more that area of the brain grows in activity. More brain is dedicated to that activity, the more we do it. So the more I ski, the more the areas associated with the muscles related to skiing, the more brain activity is geared towards those muscles and that activity, right? Fascinating stuff for what we've been learning with regard to virtue, habits, and whatnot. When neurons fire simultaneously, their synaptic connections become stronger, raising the chance that the firing of one will trigger the firing of the other. So if we consistently do, maybe the easiest example here, addiction. Someone does something over and over again habitually, like shoots up heroin, over and over and over. And every time they shoot heroin, it's associated with needles. It's associated with plastic like bags, a heating device to often melt the heroin down, right, so they can put it into the syringe. You've got this whole process that one goes through to get the heroin into the needle and inject it. If a person does this enough, when they're trying to stop, so let's say man, I'm tired of doing heroin, I want to stop. We call them triggers. You see a needle and suddenly the desire to shoot heroin becomes strong, it spikes, because you have a trigger, something that reminds you of that. You've created a strong neural network associating various heating devices, sometimes tinfoil or spoons, needles, other things with shooting heroin. So when you're trying to stop, it's hard when you're around those triggers, because once the brain sees one, it immediately triggers the desire, because they've been associated with each other over and over and over again. Well, obviously that's a negative example, but imagine if we could create positive neural networks like this, where, right, regular things trigger generosity. A suffering person triggers compassion. Can we train ourselves to have other kinds of triggers that might not be related to doing heroin? It seems that we can. Again, the brain is shaped according to our behavior. Change our behavior, change our brain. A lovely sort of analogy that's been used is of sledding. I think I've said this maybe early on in the semester. But think of it like when you go snow sledding. You take your little toboggan out. I've got a 3-year-old, so we go sledding when it snows. And the first time down the hill, the snow is really deep and you sort of sink into it and you don't go very far. So then we walk back up to the top again. Now we go down that part that we've packed down, so we've got a little bit of a run going. We pick up speed and we plow through a little bit deeper down the hill. We do it again, we do it again. After about 5 or 6 times, we make it all the way down the hill and we really pack the snow down. And then it's just a matter of we go further and further and further because we keep packing it down more and more. Well, after a while, when you go back to the top of the hill, as soon as you put the toboggan down, it's ready to take off down that same groove, right? It's not going to go other places because the snow hasn't been packed down there yet. Neural networks are similar. Do something once, okay, you create a little bit of a groove. Do something twice, okay. Do something habitually, suddenly that neural network's got this strong groove so that anything associated with it goes down this line of thinking. It can be positive ways of thinking, negative ways of thinking. It can be related to, I've been abandoned in my past, so now I'm more likely to reject people or hold them at arm's length, or I've had really good experiences, so I'm more inclined to be vulnerable and open and love. But the good news is they're not set. These patterns are not set. These networks, these neural networks are not set. We can create new sledding grooves by our actions, by what we surround ourselves with, which always makes me nervous, right, to think about what hours of watching TV does to a person's brain, hours in front of a Facebook page does to our brain, just creating these grooves and these hard-won networks that shorten our attention spans, that might make it harder to connect to real people because we're connecting all over the internet. I mean, who knows what the ramifications are, but we know that through texting that teenagers' vocabulary decreases each year, right? The next set of teens, the next generation, the vocabulary is less and less and less. The number of words they have mastery over less and less. Well, they have to say everything they want to say in 100 characters or less. Everything's abbreviated. Nothing's even spelled or punctuated correctly over instant message, email, or text. So you wonder what habits are being formed and how to reverse them, let alone habits related to spiritual formation and morality. It seems like the church has given us a ton of spiritual practices that might help overcome some of this. We've lost some of them. Fasting, confession. We probably don't pray and read scripture and things as much, but solitude, silence. But again, neuroscience is supporting this. Fascinating. I mentioned addiction triggers again, but the good news again is that they're not set in stone, but it takes hard work. Here's my problem. My problem is that often what I hear in Christian circles is, well, just make better choices. You shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have said that. You should know better. Willpower. I don't think that's the answer. I think we have to equip ourselves to make different choices. We have to begin to equip ourselves to know better. I can't just suddenly one day wake up and say, I'm going to be a totally different person. All of my desires I will change. All of my natural, habitual inclinations I will overcome today. That's how we feel, right? I'll make good choices today. But then inevitably that doesn't happen. We might be able to do it for a day, an hour, a week, but inevitably who we are comes out. So the process is creating habits that shape us so that when situations arise, we are different people that now react differently because of the slow incremental change that's happened and that's occurred, the formation that's occurred. And we see this with addiction. There's been fascinating studies with people who have sexual addictions and the brain, what happens, right? So sex addicts often, what's happened is they've participated in high dopamine behaviors. Sex produces a lot of dopamine, a lot of adrenaline, jumping out of airplanes, bungee jumping. If you engage in high dopamine behaviors on a regular basis, having sex with random people in public places, maybe you're going to get caught cheating on your wife, doing these other things creates lots of adrenaline, lots of dopamine. If you do that regularly, your brain has dopamine producers and dopamine receptors. If you flood the brain with dopamine on a regular basis, the brain will adjust itself and create more dopamine receptors. It will actually create more. Fascinating, right? Well, the problem is if your brain creates more dopamine receptors, now a normal dose of dopamine is not enough to stimulate the same feeling in you. You've got to up the stakes. You've got to up the ante. You've got to have weirder sex. You've got to, again, maybe have a chance to get caught, maybe public places, maybe you name it, right? Sex addicts have crazy stories. But you've flooded your brain with dopamine over and over again. It's created more dopamine receptors, and now normal sexual activity, normal dopamine activity isn't enough to stimulate you, and there's a problem. But if over time, and this takes years, you disengage from high dopamine behaviors, you disengage from pornography and sexuality, at least in high dopamine kinds of contexts, what will happen is your brain stops producing that dopamine over a long period of time. Suddenly, the brain will reduce the amount of dopamine receptors so that you can actually, the brain will heal itself, but it's predicated on our habits and behavior, right? Really interesting studies related to habit forming and overcoming addiction. Again, this is a hard-won second nature through a lot of work. But this means maybe holiness is possible, right? Maybe our character can really be shaped in formative ways as a result of shaping our brain. The book mentions lots of experiments. I'm just going to mention 3. They all occur from page 34 to 37. Monkeys, right? So there's the owl monkeys and the spinning disc. This is where the researchers had a spinning disc and the monkeys were going to touch the spinning disc, but not, if they touched it too hard, it would knock it off its spin. If they touched it too lightly, right, it wouldn't stop it. So they had to touch it just enough and have a very delicate touch with their fingers. And they did this again over the course of 200 days, right, more than half a year doing this with the monkeys. But then what they show is that the brain area related to touch and finger sensitivity increased. More brain activity was geared to those activities because of these habits, these daily experiments, right? They talked about the owl monkeys and the flutter detection. So they would take like a feather, something flutter along the hand, very sensitive, very delicate, and the monkeys were asked to really decipher how many times they were touched. So they're spending a lot of attention and energy trying to figure out the flutter on the hand. And doing this over and over again for 200 days or more, the area of the brain dedicated to that kind of sense detection on the hand increased 3-fold. They did this experiment with squirrel monkeys with the banana pellets in the small container versus the large one. The small container, they couldn't get 2 hands in there. So the monkey, to get the banana pellet, would have to stick 1 finger in and then push down so that the pellet would stick to the finger and then grab it and eat. So they had to use a lot of finger dexterity over and over again for a long period of time. Well, then that brain area associated with that index finger increased by twice, right, doubled in size, as compared to those chimpanzees or those monkeys that had a large bowl where they could fit 2 fingers in and they didn't have to concentrate, right, on that 1 finger. So we see the effects. And then the quote here on 36, right, she's only relating to studies 1 and 2 with this quote, but study number 3 is directly related. The twin discoveries from the spinning disc and the fluttering device show that the physical layout of the brain, how much space it apportions to which tasks, how strongly one neural firing is connected to another, is shaped by experiences and by the life that we live. Right? So much for genetic determinism. Chapter 8 is when we get into some more complicated things, not monkey fingers, but rather attachment, how our relationships function, how much empathy and compassion do we show. And can that be changed, right? So she talks about 3 types of attachment. And for those of you that are skeptical of some of this, let me just tell you, you have every right to be skeptical in certain ways, but there is a lot of research on attachment in children. And seeing attachment styles develop in 3- and 4-year-olds, and then doing longitudinal studies where they will follow those same 3- and 4-year-olds, interview them periodically, and watch them periodically throughout their lives. And those with secure attachment, right, consistently show certain outputs, more likely to go to college, more likely to stay married, etc., etc. Other forms of attachment from early on, these longitudinal studies show less likely to be ambitious, less likely to be able to stay married. So there is a lot of research. Now, it's not determinism, but it is about patterns of behavior, patterns of emotional reaction to scenarios and things. It's something I take very seriously as a parent of a 3-year-old, and we're working really hard to try to create secure and good attachment, but it's not always easy. Typically, if you have 2 loving parents and a safe and secure environment, then you end up with secure attachment. But you know, many people grow up in single-parent homes, violent communities, other things, and these survival instincts kick in. I got to keep people at arm's length. I've been hurt. I've been molested. I've been wounded. I've been abused. I need to protect myself in certain ways, so you create natural responses that hinder behavior in certain ways. I think she does a good job of just explaining these 3. I'm not here to defend them, but it is interesting to see what changes can come about, right? She lists symptoms of secure attachment. They often have close relationships, not always, but more likely. They're more trusting, less dogmatic. This is very interesting, but I think logically it makes sense. They're often more open to other ideas. They're less defensive of their own ideas. They're more open-minded. Because if you're secure, I don't have to be threatened by new ideas. I have a secure base from which to explore new ideas. If I don't agree with them, I come back to my secure base. If I'm an insecure person, every new idea poses a threat to me, and so no, let's shut it down, censor it, don't let anyone see it because how, right? No, it can't be. But a lot of that stems from insecurity on our own part, right? Less judgmental. I'm more willing to deal with difference, to know that you're different than me and be respectful of that, because I'm a secure person who's not threatened by the fact that you're different, right? Which means secure people are more tolerant, again, not only of ideas, but often other people. They display more empathy and compassion. They feel badly when they see other people suffering. And there's lots of data and research and experiments to show that people who have poor attachment, when they see someone suffering, have less emotional states. We can see it even in the brain. The emotional centers of the brain are less active in those that have poor attachment than in those who are well attached, with regard to empathizing and having compassion on those who suffer. They're often more likely to volunteer, be engaged in church. They self-report higher levels of happiness and healthy relationships than those with poor attachment. So again, this is not a foolproof plan. This is not every person who has secure attachment has all these things, but the statistics suggest that these things are more probable in a securely attached person. But there's evidence suggesting you might have been raised in a particular environment, you might have had particular parents, but there's hope. You're not doomed to go down this road. And so she starts in this chapter just saying one of the areas we're just exploring now, just beginning to explore, is the idea of priming. So priming is artificially activating neural circuits related to secure attachment, right? We take someone who does not have secure attachment, we have them read through scenarios, we prime them with words about love. We might have names of loved ones because if they've filled out information about themselves before they're doing experiments, we might be able to prime it with their mother's name or people they feel comfortable with. Other things related to trust. After priming them, we give them, researchers give them scenarios where they either have to respond to in writing or verbally, or in action, they have to respond to others. We see that if they have the priming, the attachment priming, they're more likely in writing, in verbal responses, and in action to act as though they're securely attached, to be more trusting, to feel more empathy and compassion, and to act accordingly. Those people with poor attachments who haven't had the priming are much less likely in writing, verbally, or in action to demonstrate compassion, empathy, and whatnot. Fascinating. So they have studies, right? The secular and Orthodox Jews, right? And they go to areas of real conflict, right? They actually go to Israel, Palestine, and these people do not like each other much. There's a lot of distrust and conflict. So they have them take tests, respond to surveys. Would you be likely to shop with this person, go to this person for help, cooperate with this person if they needed help? If they've had the attachment priming, they answered differently, more like a securely attached person, than if they don't have the priming. So we see changes consistently. Well, what if we started priming ourselves habitually? Praying, meditating, thinking, reading about love, trust, relationships, attachment. Maybe these things might become more natural, right? I loved the example of the researchers doing gory things, right? They take a subject and they're brought into a room where they're watching a monitor, and this person is in the room, in a research lab, so they're watching on a monitor. On the monitor is a person in a research lab. And this person's being asked to do various things. Touch a tarantula, look at gory pictures of people who have gross injuries, pet a snake, right? And so the person watching on the monitor sees that this researcher doesn't want to do the things. I don't want to touch the tarantula. And as these things increase, the person gets more and more emotionally, right, distraught. Please don't make me touch the snake. No, no, no. I don't think I can do it. And then they'll turn off the recording, and the researcher comes into the room and basically says, will you take over for person A? They're no longer willing to do it. And those that are securely attached feel more compassion for the person who's been forced to touch a tarantula and a snake. They're more likely to help. They're more likely, right, not only to feel certain things, but to actually say, yes, I'll do it for them. I'll replace them in that. Those who are poorly attached are less likely to act in those ways. They don't feel as much compassion, and they're not as likely to act. However, if poorly attached people have been primed with certain words, phrases, if they use certain names for the person who's unwilling to touch the tarantula and whatnot, all of a sudden, they start acting like the securely attached person. They're more likely to go in the room and pet the snake or the tarantula. So these things can be changed, and habits might be able to make permanent changes in these ways. Something I want to highlight as we move forward to my paper, one of the things I emphasize is that we often think moral judgments and moral behavior stems from reason. We deliberate about moral decisions and then we try to do the right thing. Lots of research suggests that our moral judgments and our moral behavior is at least initially impacted by how we feel, our affective states or our emotional states. And that often if we feel twinges of disgust, we judge things as immoral. If we feel twinges of empathy, we're more likely to help. And we see this in the experiment. Those that feel higher forms of empathy and compassion for the one who doesn't want to touch the tarantula or the snake are more likely to say, I'll do it for them, I'll help them. If you have low levels of emotion, empathy, and compassion, you're less likely to help. Well then, if we're going to change moral behavior, maybe what we should start training are our emotional states. Rather than emphasizing reason, what should I do in scenario A? You might know what you should do, but if you don't have the right emotional states, you won't do it, because emotion motivates behavior. So maybe to increase moral behavior, to increase spiritual formation, maybe what we need to be training are our emotional or affective states. And I start sort of talking about that in the paper and how we might best do that. So I hope this helps and it got you thinking. If you've got questions, comments, you want to react, push back, let's do it on the discussion board. I hope it's exciting. I'll hope to see you online.